All right, guys, welcome back to part 2, the final piece of remanufacturing our NP246 here. Where we left off in part 1 was we were just ready to do the shim onto the clutch pack. So we had just gone through the shimming procedure in our service manual, and we had determined what shim we needed. I got a couple updates to share with you on that. So we went over the fact that all of these shims used to be in a package, and then I shared with you that there was a service bulletin that broke them off back in 2004 into separately orderable part numbers, right? And then what I found in trying to obtain the one I needed was that there's actually been there was at some time some additional ones that were put out. And basically what GM did is they came out with, of these numbers that you saw, starting with this 30.30 millimeter one and then the 0.5 millimeter one, they added this 0.25 in between with that number there. And then what they did for each one, they stuck one in the middle. So then they added a 0.675 between these two, a 0.925 between these two, a 1.175 between these two, a 1.425 between these two, and finally between the last two, a 1.675. And these numbers here were the new numbers at some point that they added. Now, they discontinued these intermediate shims at some point, so those I just did in yellow are all discontinued now. But interestingly enough, whereas the base shims are not available aftermarket, these intermediate ones are. And so either way, I'll put the links in the description for all these different GM part numbers, as well as the one aftermarket manufacturer that covers these sizes, which is USA Standard Gear. But anyway, we've got ours, and so they sometimes don't come in a traditional GM package like you would expect, because they may be in a bag with the dealer or something of that nature. And they also might have some anti-corrosion material on them you'll want to get off with solvent. But there's our shim, so we're done with that piece, and now we're just going to pick up and keep going. So the next thing we're going to be doing is putting the bearing in and building out this clutch pressure plate hub. So we've got ITC 31 all cleaned up and restored here. We've got ITC 29 from our parts explosion. And then our original bearing was ITC 30. And this is another one of those situations where the balls are open in this cage design, and then they're kind of closed on that cage design. And originally, that would have been installed like this. But since the new replacement bearings aren't like that, the new replacement one is 123-84993. And that's just going to be like we saw in the first video. It's just going to be more where it's visible on both sides, so the orientation doesn't really matter, but I like to take the writing in those kind of situations and have that face in the same direction that this cage seal would have been in there. So let's go over to the press and get this setup reassembled so we can put it on. All right, guys, so we're going to take the bearing and, like I said, find where the writing is. If you don't have that kind of cage like the original one, we're going to put that facing down. Put our hub piece in the center. And then what we're going to do to push this guy in from our driver kit is we're going to use a 45 on the inner and a 64 on the outer. If we kind of zoom in, we can see that writing. All right, just like that. Let's get him centered and just push him in. Until he bottoms out. And you'll know when he bottoms out because you'll feel it. All right, so what you want to see is you want to see this guy in the inner race all level and even. All right, so now let's put this in the outer piece. All right, guys, so this piece, the assembly is not going to require much force to get in, just because of how it's designed. It's an awkwardly shaped piece, so GM did not intend for you to have to use any special tools or press. So we're just going to drive it in. And basically what you're after is you're going to seat the bearing against this ridge on the back of this plate. Actually, guys, I grabbed the wrong drift. This one's too big. Let me grab the other one. All right, this one's much better. I'm just going to drive it in until it seats. Right. Just make sure it's seated all the way around. See, it doesn't really sit in there very tightly. There we go. All right, she's good to go. All right, guys, so like I was saying, got to make sure she's fully seated, bearing against the bottom of the plate and resting on there. So now this assembly is ready to install. And when we install this, these spokes are going to fit in these slots. And when those spokes are in those slots, we're going to have the ability to push it down a bit. So the next thing they would have talked about here is if you had a later model than I'm showing here that had the preload clutch, you would have this pressure plate spring that would go on first, and he would kind of ride in a groove. If you remember in the previous video, we talked about the differences in these parts. This is a non-preload clutch, and so we don't have this part to install, but there it is if you do. So the next thing we've got is to put the retaining moon clip in here, right? So that's ITC 32. It's one of these kind of half moon type clips, and that's going to get replaced by a GM 125-47623. All we're going to do on this is slide this into that groove that you see right there. You can see this groove cut into the shaft. And we're just going to push this in. Should be able to push this in with our finger. Let's see. There we go. All right, so now that's done. And now the next thing we're going to want to do is now we're going to want to mate this assembly up with the front case half. So we're going to push this in there. They're telling you to make sure that you align the tab on the pressure plate bearing hub with the clutch lever, and that you align the output shaft teeth to the planetary carrier and the range sleeve teeth. All right, so what they're talking about here is this is the tab they're talking about lining up with the clutch lever. Of course, these are the teeth. All right, so let's get that going. So let's bring our front case half over to the bench, and let's get those two mated up. All right, guys, so we're about to put this back into our front case half. If we come in on this side, the service manual didn't tell us to do this, but I'm going to put some fluid down in this bearing, this pilot bearing. And we're going to put some on the end of the main shaft too, because even though when we put everything in here, it's going to hopefully flood all of this, and the service manual doesn't ask you to do anything because of that, this particular guy is going to run dry for longer than anything else. So I like to put a little bit of something on him just proactively. The other thing we'll do is we'll put a little bit on each of these friction points. Put a little bit on this friction point with this guy. And again, you know, once we flood this by putting everything in, we should be fine. But this is a case where the service manual doesn't necessarily think it's necessary, and I'm just passing it on as something I like to do. All right, now we're going to pick this assembly up. And this tab here, what they were saying earlier in the manual, this tab, we want to see sitting between that part of the lever, between the fork part. Obviously, if you try to put it on this side, you're going to bang up against the lever. Okay. And then it's just a matter of lining up the teeth and letting it drop in. Of course, make sure you've got this guy well secured. All right, so now back to our assembly manual. It's time for the sprockets and chain. So we've cleaned up our originals. So we've got ITC 13 that sat on this side. And we've got ITC 8 that sat on the other side. And we don't necessarily need to get these on yet because we still got the chain to do. Now, our original chain was ITC 11. Probably could have reused it, but you know, it's got almost 300,000 miles on it, and so I elected to change the chain. I carefully examined the teeth on the sprocket. You know, gave them the fingernail test. They're in very good condition, but if you note in the disassembly manual, there was just a little bit more slop than I liked on that chain. There's nothing in either the unit repair manual or in the service information that talks about how to tell if the chain's too worn, so it's very subjective, but I went ahead and changed it. Now, these chains on these older ones are discontinued, but it's a 12547 662. You can still find them. They're discontinued, just a little bit of a Easter egg hunt. And what you want to do on these GM chains is you want to find the blue link, like this guy. One of these links, at least on these older chains, one of these links is going to be blue. All right, and if you look in the service information, what they tell you down here is the blue chain links must face towards the rear of the vehicle, right? So that's why it's important to catch this. All right, so now with the new chain, I expect that we'll have to do a little bit of a dance here to get this guy on. And that's good, because we got tighter tolerance this time around. Just want to line those teeth up. That one's lined up. This one's not lined up. Almost. But yeah, that's, you know, if it went in real loose, I would say that's a problem. Let me see if I can find my little rubber-tipped hammer here. Nope. This is why you want to use rubber, so you can tell if you've got it stuck on something. There we go. All right. It's not that it only goes on one way. It's just that it's got its own finicky way it wants to go. Now you can see there's still, even with a brand new chain, there's still some slop here. If you were to go back and watch the disassembly video, I think you'd find out that it's not as bad. All right, so I'm happy with that. Let's get some of this stuff cleaned up. We're going to put a couple of snap rings in. As you see in the service manual, they're talking to us about installing the drive sprocket retaining rings. So there's one on the main output shaft, and then we got a couple other rings to go do. I guess they're going to have us go through this before we put the other one on. All right, let me get those rings and some of these other parts. So we're just about done, guys. All right, so we got some of this other stuff out of the way. Let's keep going. So now they want us to install the drive sprocket retaining ring on the main output shaft, the one that goes right here. So if we reference our parts explosion, that's ITC 7. So we're looking for ITC 7. There's our original, and that's going to be replaced by GM 12547 477. our snap ring pliers. Get this guy into position. All right, got to get it past this little ridge it fell into and get it flush with the sprocket. Okay, that's in place. Let's move on. Position, make sure he's fully seated all the way around. Next thing we've got, so they're going over the different shafts, different rear output shafts, and which design is first and second. The original design is number 2. The later replacement is number 1. The only reason this is important is on the original design, there is going to be a oil pump retaining ring here. And we have the original, so we're going to need to install that. And that is going to be internal transfer case part 6, right? So there's our original one. And that's going to be replaced again by a 12547606. Right, so same kind of deal as that. We're going to bring this guy down, and we're going to get him into this groove right here. Happy with how he's sitting there. All right, guys, I wasn't happy with the fitment of that part, and it turns out that it was the wrong number. This guy here is actually a GM 12547475, and so what I did for now is I just put the original back on, just so I can continue going with this. I'll see if I can track one of those down. So let's go on to the next step here. So we've got this oil pump retaining ring. The next thing would be to get the oil pump going. So here's our original pump, ITC Part 5. We decided not to reuse it because of the problem that we had with this unit with the really old, molasses kind of fluid. You can't really rebuild these things. So we're going to replace it with a new pump, a GM 12547630. There's our brand new pump assembly. And then they're also talking about a new O-ring and the wave washer. Now I'm going to grab the wave washer first because it's handy. I've got ITC4 for that. We're just going to reuse our old one for that piece. So those two parts. And then they're going to want us to put on the retaining snap ring for the other sprocket. Our original on that was ITC12. And that, just like the other side, is going to be another one of these 12547477 parts. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and throw that on right now while I'm up here and get that out of the way. All right, and again, just like on the other side, you want to make sure everything is fully seated by looking around to the other side. And then the one other thing that we need is our O-ring, and our old O-ring, so the other thing would have been in here is the filter will come up on front case half 17 and 18, the filter and the little O-ring. We ended up wanting to replace the filter as well because of, again, the problem with the molasses old fluid. We just could not clean this guy out because you can't open him. So we ended up replacing that as well. So let me grab these two parts and let's put all this together. All right, so here's our pump. We're ready to put our pump on. It's going to go in over here, but before we put it on, the manual talked about putting the O-ring inside. Now, the O-ring part number for the GM, if I hand it handy here, is 155-47430. But you're going to notice here that I've got a Mopar number, 433-8942. And the reason for that is that new process, like I said in one of the earlier videos, made these for both GM and Chrysler because it was a joint venture between the two companies. And so what you're really looking at here, this is not a Dodge part going on a Chevy truck. This is a new process part that went on both. And so since this is a discontinued O-ring, I just grabbed whatever I could find because this is neither a GM part nor a Mopar part. It's a new process part. So let me give it a little bit of lubrication with some Auto-Trak II fluid. And then we'll insert it into the bore of the pump. She's kind of crooked in there, so we definitely want to fix that. There we go. All right, so she's where we want her. And the pump would sit on in this direction. Get the gears to line up. It's kind of like the sprockets in the chain earlier. And it sits against that little ring that we just put in there. And then our wave washer. I think we've got too many ports that we've got to sort through here. There he goes, ITC4. All right, so he's going to go up with the wavy part facing up, like that. So now we've done this and we've done this. We did that already with the retaining sprocket. Now we've got the filter, the pipe, and the connector. So the hard pipe and the rubber piece is front case half 15 and 16 from the parts explosion. Our replacement screen is a 155/47/432. That's another discontinued part. Just kind of work that guy on there. All right, so for this, we're going to walk around to the other side. Feed our pipe in from underneath our chain. Get this guy in his little home there. And then we're going to, again, put a little bit, if we can squeeze out any more, just a little bit more Auto-Trak fluid. Feed this guy into the O-ring. There we go. All right. So at this point, we can see if we need to take out any slack on the rubber hose to make sure everything is nice and happy, right? So this should be sitting in here, lined up along with that mating surface, rubber, then metal pipe, flush inside the pump. And it's very important you get it flush inside the pump because you don't want to lose any pump sucking pressure. This is the lifeblood of the unit. And the last thing we're going to pop in here is front case half part 19, which is the magnet. We've got that all cleaned up. So he just drops right in there. Okay. And so again, just want to keep making sure, do you have all of your slack out of this rubber connector so that everything is sitting where it needs to sit. And with that, we can move on to the next piece. Okay, let's keep going, right? So we put our screen, we put on our suction pipe, and we put on our hose that connects the two, and we got it hooked up to the O-ring in the pump. We put in our magnet. Now we want to drop our speed sensor reluctor wheel on. That's ITC part 3, our original. So we got that all cleaned up and restored and ready to go. Okay, so that guy's on. And now we're going to have a bearing and another retaining ring. And then we're going to start the case protector. So let's do the bearing and the retaining ring. Okay, so our original bearing was ITC2. And again, it's got that kind of design where you've got like the cage area and then the visible balls. We're going to be replacing that with a GM 88962351. And once again, it's open balls on both sides. But this time, there's another characteristic, and it's this groove for the ring that retains the front case half to this bearing. So we know that we can put this with the writing side up. All right, so now we've got that guy on there. We just give him a little bit of a press, and we got room to put the retaining ring. So the retaining ring for this was ITC 1. And that's going to get replaced by a GM 124-70554. Now this is a thick one. This one's a little bit harder to get on than the thin, skinnier ones. So first step is to get him around the shaft before he goes flying. Okay. And get him over this little ridge. Now we don't have him in the groove yet. At least we don't have him in all the way. Get that side in. And now we got him in the groove. All right. Again, you go all the way around and you make sure that you truly have him all the way in the groove. Back to our manual. So we just put that guy on. All right, so let's talk about this guy. So let me go get the rear case half and show you where this went, what it did, and why we're not going to use it again. All right, so this is the original piece that prevents the steel pump. So you see this pump's edges are steel. And they can cut into the recesses they sit in the magnesium. And so originally, this rear case half 13 part would sit right here. And you'd kind of stake him onto that nub, and he'd sit in here, and he would prevent the metal from cutting in the magnesium. What usually happens on these, though, is they come unstaked and they fall out, or because they're so thin, they get cut through. This guy knocks around and starts making holes in the case, and it leaks. And so one of the things you have to do on these is make sure you don't have any of those holes. You kind of have to do the light test, right? We shine an LED through the front, and you look on the outside, and you make sure on the outside here that at none of these bosses do you see light coming through, right? That's how you know if anything has cut through, because it can be very, very small. Now, we didn't have any evidence of that leaking on here. The problem on this guy was it was leaking through this port, which is a different problem. So we didn't have that issue, and he hadn't fallen out, but we're not going to reuse him. We're going to follow this GM service bulletin about an improved wear clip that deals with this problem. We're not going to use an aftermarket case saver. We're going to use what GM and new process worked out to solve this problem. And that new clip is part number 890-59653, and it replaces the previous one I showed you that was 124-70559. So 124-70559 is this guy. Do not use this guy. The new one is this guy. 890-59653, and he looks like this. And basically what happens is on the pump blade that would normally sit with the recess with the nub, this guy's going to slide on there. Right? And so we're going to take this guy and we're going to position him such that when the case is in, this guy is going to be sitting on the blade over there. So it's going to the other side because it's going to be on the other side that gets this attached. All right, so this is the particular blade that would come in contact with that. And this is the guy we want to make sure is fully snapped on here so he doesn't come off. And that is going to be just like what we see in the service manual picture here, so that when this guy's sitting in the case, those little wings are facing up like that. The metal here is much thicker, and he's going to be able to not pop off and also not let the blade cut into the magnesium case. All right, so the other thing we want to do here is we want to make sure that this is super tight. All right, so this one's kind of a little bit loose. So we're going to slide it back off again. And we're going to push these clips in a little bit. Just bend them in just a little bit. because we want this guy to be on here as tight as we can get it. Now that's tight. That's super tight. And that's exactly the adjustment the service bulletin points out. All right, so remember the wavy wings are going to point in the same direction that the nub on the rear case half would point. All right, so if he's pointing in this direction, the waves are going to be up in this direction. So in the orientation, we've got the front case half, this is upside down. But when we eventually put this on, it's going to be in the correct orientation. All right, next they're going to want us to make sure that the two alignment dowels are in position and ready to go. Now they're showing putting them into the front case half, but we have them in the rear case half. You know, they're sitting right here. We'll tap them out before we put these two together. And then they're going to talk to us about, and they call them the locating pins, they're going to talk to us about cleaning the surface because we're getting ready to glue these two together with some RTV sealant. GM part number 123-45739 is what they recommend. This is an older number. I'll show you the more current number that I'm going to be using. But before we do that, we got a couple other things to do. So we took out, in the disassembly video, we took this bushing out. So we're going to need to replace that. That's one thing we're going to need to do. They don't mention it, but we're going to need to replace rear case half part 15, which is this locking ring that holds these two halves together. And that's going to get replaced by a GM 12547-637. Right, I'm going to take one of these out and just temporarily, for now, I'm going to put it up here into this groove on this bearing. Right, but this, if you recall, when we started this whole project, is the guy that we reached our snap ring pliers in through this little access port, and we expanded him to get him off this bearing, right? So that's one of the other things that we have to replace. For some reason, the service manual doesn't mention this particular ring, so we needed to do that. All right, so let's go over to the press and let's get our bushing put in. We'll come back, we'll knock our alignment pins through so they're flush with the top sticking out the bottom. We'll make sure we got our case halves clean, and we'll lay down a bead of RTV and get this. They talk about how you set this ring. So they tell you to take the snap ring pliers, open that retaining ring for the rear output shaft bearing, right, just like you did when you first took it apart. They just never told you to put it on there. Anyway, we'll get this all put together, and we'll get our bolts in, and we'll let the RTV set up. All right, we're out at the hydraulic press. So remember, guys, what we're doing is we're taking rear case half part 2 from our parts explosion, which is this bushing that goes in the inner bore here of the rear case half, and we're going to replace it with a GM 156-65313 part. And I'm just going to kind of eyeball them just to make sure, but that does look like the correct part cosmetically, and of course it is the right number. Now these flutes that you see cut on the inside for fluid passage, when we removed our old one of them lined up with this return gallery hole right down here. And so what we'll do is we'll put that back in that kind of position when we press it in. It may or may not matter, right? But we're going to do that just to get it kind of back to the way we found it, actually like this, right? So this particular flute here in line with that drain. The other thing I'm going to be doing, it's not in the service manual, is I'm going to be using this Loctite 640 product. Now this is not something that's that common, but this is a product that they make specifically for helping to lock in bushings. And the reason I'm using that is since this magnesium alloy is kind of soft, you know, pressing out the old bushing and getting ready to push this new one in, we could have lost a few 10,000ths in the diameter, and this will help make sure that that's not the case. We've got a little bit of a rag with brake clean on it that we're going to make sure that any of the oils from my skin here get wiped off. And then what we're going to do is on the edge that we're going to be pushing this in, we're going to run some of this stuff. And we don't need a whole lot. Find an end of my rag here that does not have any solvent on it. and then any excess we have will get pushed out as we go through this process. All right. Now we're going to be using our 50 and 48, and the reason I'm using a 50 rather than something larger is the original bushing was not set in flush. It had a slight depression to it, and we're going to try to replicate that. Or slight indent, I guess I should say. The main thing with this is we want to make sure that we don't get this thing going and cocked, because we don't have a tool that runs the full length of the bushing. And so that is a concern. Once you can get it in about a third of the way, it should be fine. So if it gets in cocked, either the tool will damage the bushing or the bushing could damage the magnesium bore. So the extra time you take here is definitely warranted. See it right there. As soon as I see it not going in completely even, just going to stop it. By the way, I got this magnesium case sitting on wood just to take some of the pressure off of it. You just got to kind of make sure that if it goes in like this, like it started to want to go in that way, we're going to have to abort, take it out, and reposition it. So let me get this out of here, and then we'll try it again. All right, guys, let's try this again. All we did was we took one of the driver handles from the kit, and we used that to kind of cock it back to where we wanted it to be. You know, part of what you get from that $500 GM tool is not having to worry about this kind of problem, right? But rather than spend the $500, I'm okay just kind of going incrementally back and forth like we're doing here. Once we can get in a third of the way, like I was saying, then we can just drive it home. We don't have to be so gentle. Right now it looks like she's going to go in nice and smooth. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this out and show you where we are. All right, so at this point, right, we got our flute lined up the way we found it with that drain, and we got her just about flush. Now we're going to do the indent, about 1 millimeter of an indent. If we zoom in close and watch her along the ridge, we can see us make that adjustment. Right, and there we go. Now we're ready to go back to the next step in the service information manual. All right, guys, it's time to put the two case halves together. Some of the last couple of things we're going to check on here is we're going to make sure that everything turns freely and doesn't bind in both directions. And we're also going to take some of our Auto-Trak II fluid again. Going to get our little dropper, pick some of this up. And what we're going to be after here is we're just going to be lubing up some of the pieces that are going to be making contact when we put the two halves together, just to make things go in easier. You can see I took that ring off of here as well, just to do this piece here. Right, this ring here. And then what we want to do is take our rear case half. Be careful not to hit the new bushing with the output shaft. And then this should, you know, with all these genuine GM parts, the fitment should be pretty good. The dowels, if they've worked their way out, you know, give them a little tap to reseat them. Get them flush again. You should just be able to wiggle this and get it to sit flush. Don't get your fingers in here, you'll get pinched. There we go. All right, so now we've got a feel for what we got to do to get it to sit down all the way. And again, we just want to get this dowel all the way down. We'll probably put a little bit of a lube on that as well. Now we're going to put the ring back on the bearing. Actually, we're going to put it back in the rear case half, and then we're going to expand it and get it around the bearing as we do that same maneuver. Let's take a quick look at the service information just to show you where we're at. Okay, so we kind of showed this page last time where they talked about the alignment dowels. They're showing them in the front case half. I have them in the rear case half. It doesn't matter. They're talking about actually ensuring that the sealing surfaces on both halves are free of dirt and oil and cleaning solvent. We're going to run some brake clean over here in just a moment. There's the locating pins they talked about. They're talking about running a 1/8 inch bead of this particular old part number of GM. This is discontinued. I'll show you what I'm going to be using, which is far superior, but still GM. And then lowering the case half into place like we just did as a test fit. And then taking some snap ring pliers and just, you know, how the whole project started, right? This is one of the very first things we did on disassembly, opening up that retaining ring, getting it around the groove in the output shaft bearing. And they're talking about if you need to, if you have a rubber-coated screwdriver, you can stick it in through one of the speed sensor holes to lift up on the reluctor wheel, if necessary, to seat that ring. And then we start putting the bolts in. All right, so let's get all set up to do that. Let me show you what the bolts are so we don't have any interruption. So our bolts were rear case half part 10. And for the most part, a lot of these bolts, these are these vinyl clad bolts. This one's not in too bad a shape, but a lot of them, the vinyl had come off all on the sides and they're corroding. And rather than run the risk of it rounding off like our pivot pins did, we're just going to replace all of these. It's just cheap insurance. And so the part number that I'll be replacing all these with is 88996722. And it's a different design. I guess it started maybe around 2001 or so. And the different design, instead of a 15 millimeter, it's a 10 millimeter. And then instead of being vinyl clad, it's just very heavily plated. And then it's got, instead of a flat aluminum washer, it's kind of got this aluminum cup to prevent the dissimilar metal corrosion with the magnesium. So this is what we'll end up running in place of the originals. And this is what we're going to end up using to seal it. This is AC Delco 88864346. So this has superseded the item that's referenced in the service manual. Now remember when we took this apart, the pump intake screen was just clogged with this sealant. So you got to go as super, super thin. I'm going to be using the most narrow part of this tip that I can get to get a bead out, because we don't need a whole lot on here given the torque of these bolts and how many of them that we have. So I'm going to take this piece off. I'm going to clean the two mating surfaces with some brake clean, let it dry up, and then we'll go ahead and put this together. All right, guys, we're ready to put these two halves together. Everything's clean. We've let it dry for a little while. Oh, I forgot to show you one other pre-check before we mate these two together and entomb everything. So right down in here, right, we put together our lever and fork assembly here that's held in with the shift shaft. And remember, we put our detent in back there. One other check is you want to make sure, if we zoom in here, that detent got caught correctly on the lever indentations and didn't like go catty corner and crooked. Right? It's difficult for the camera to focus way down in here. There we go. Right, so that guy right there, we want to make sure he's right in there. And if we watch that, you're going to see it move, and I'm going to go give it a test move here, and I'll show you how I'm doing that in just a second. Right, we're making sure that this goes in through those different positions. Now the reason I did that, if we come over here and look underneath, all I did on this model is put a little crescent wrench here and do what the encoder motor would do, right? The encoder motor would normally grab these and turn them. I'm just making sure everything moves okay. The other thing I'm doing is I'm taking a look at our actual restored encoder motor, front case half part 28, and I'm taking a look at what position was the slot in. Now later models are going to have a star design for this rather than these flats, and you may have to figure out a different way to grab it. But what we want to do is we want to get this into the position that it was removed in so that when we put it back together, right, it just slides right on. All right, guys, let's seal her up. What's nice about these Delco tubes is they've got a little twisty on the outside. So you see the width of what I'm doing here? That's the maximum width that you want to go to avoid waste getting clipped off on the inside and ending up on the filter. So let me run this all the way around and we'll come back and inspect my work. All right, guys, we've got our RTV laid down, so you can take a look around the entire perimeter, in this case, of the front case half. And we're ready to put the rear case half on. I've gone ahead and put the retaining ring in its home, which is right up in here, in the recess ahead of the flats for the rear output bearing. Now we're going to reposition this in. Be careful, again, that you don't scrape up the bushing with the output shaft. Right, it'll slide down to a certain degree. And just like we started this whole project, we got to get this opened up so that we can get it the rest of the way and get it slid down into position. I got a feeling it's hung up on this side rather than that side. Let's see. There we go. All right, now we can come back and solve this problem. He's still not in there all the way. But we're on a time limit with the RTV. So what I do want to do is I want to go ahead and get some of these bolts started. And we'll go work on getting that retaining ring into its little slot in a moment. So let me run these in, guys, and then we'll pick it up after they're all ready to be driven down. All right, guys, if we zoom in here in this speed sensor hole, we can see the reluctor wheel. I'm going to take a plastic flat bladed type tool and stick it under the wheel. And if we come back over where our clip is, I meant to show this to you, but when I went to test it, it popped right in. So unfortunately, you'll have to kind of go with me here, right? So when I push down on this, you can see there's some movement in the bearing, right? There's not much movement now because the ring has seated. Right there, you can see it. You can hear it and you can see it moving, right? And so the ring will kind of ride up. If we look on maybe this corner, you can see it'll kind of ride up on the casting. And then when you lift up on it, like that, it'll drop right in. All right, so we're done with that. Now what we need to do is we need to drive down all of these bolts before our RTV sets up. Now don't use an impact hammer because you'll damage the magnesium, but you can use a ratchet. An electric ratchet is fine. We're just going to alternate on both sides. Right? I'm not going to bore you guys with the whole thing there. We're going to go ahead and alternate all the way around. We're going to let that just seat these. It's good if we see some sealant coming through on this side because that's what we wanted. We want it to come through on this side, not the inside. Otherwise, if it comes off on the inside, it's going to end up in the pump filter. You'll notice I've got one of the old bolts here, and that's because if you watch my disassembly video, you know I marked this guy because we left the wiring harness on the truck. So we'll use this to seat our RTV, and then we'll take it off and put one of the new ones on when we get ready to reinstall it. So we're just going to go around, get all these tightened up, let it sit for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and torque them. All right, guys, so just wanted you to see the notes and the service information here, right? Again, there's always this constant stressing about magnesium, and they want to make sure that you insulate the magnesium from anything made of steel or galvanic corrosion will occur. This is also called dissimilar metal corrosion. Nylon-coated case bolts and aluminum washers must be used. Only aluminum fill and drain plugs. Only aluminum brackets under the case bolts. Make sure new seals are installed that have a rubber insulated outside diameter with no tears or cuts. Extensive damage will occur if there is galvanic corrosion between the magnesium and steel components. The replacement case half bolt studs have an aluminum cup style washer. That's what we used here, the newer ones. The replacement case bolt studs can be used again if the cup washer is not faulty, unlike the nylon coated ones that can't be reused once the nylon is broke. 27 foot-pounds is what these get. So we've gone around and torqued everything. We got the last few pieces, guys. Let's wrap it up. Install the access hole plug. So the access hole plug, we're going to be putting a new one on, part number 12470560. And the reason we're replacing this, if you recall, this was front case or rear case half part 16. You know, it looks fine, but we had this problem where we were leaking fluid through the top. And it was leaking right from this guy. So it's cheap insurance to replace it. So we're going to take that guy, we're going to push him right into there. Yeah, this guy's a lot tighter than the original one. Should solve that problem. All right, once he's situated, then we're going to move to the speed sensors. New O-ring seals. So we have all of our old O-rings, and we just keep them in order to check sizes for the new ones. The new ones are part number 19133158. All right, so we can see correct size. We've got 3 of these guys. And then we're going to take our 3 sensors and we're going to install a new O-ring on each one. And then what we're going to do before we actually install the guy is, once again, we're going to lubricate them with some Auto-Trak II blue Smurf blood. Before we actually install them. All right, so I'm going to go get each one of these ready to install, and then we'll come back and torque them. All right, guys, taking a 19 millimeter socket. And you can drive all 3 of these in. And then what we're going to do is we're going to torque them to 11 foot-pounds. Many times the torque for these older ones is wrong. Anything more than 11 and they will shatter. And sometimes even on a lot of torque wrenches, like mine included, 11 is such a small value that you won't even get a solid click out of it. You'll just kind of feel the detent of the torque spring. So watch out for that. Okay, so let's go back to our manual. So we tightened everything to 11 foot-pounds. We lubricated the seals with transfer case fluid. Okay, so they're going through each one, right? So the front, the rear, right? So we've got one here, left and right, and then we got a rear one over here. There's 3 of them, all the same torque value. Now at this point, they would talk to you about putting the encoder motor back on. This is optional. I like to put it on after everything's installed. But just to show you what we've got here, we've got our encoder motor all restored, front case part 28 like I showed earlier. It's all ready to get onto the vehicle. And we've gotten a new seal for it. 88, 89, 1184. These are discontinued, so they're kind of hard to track down, but if your old one, doesn't have these silicone inserts damaged, you can probably reuse it, or if it isn't bent. In this case of ours, it was pretty bad, so we got rid of it. You can replace these bolts, but I didn't feel I needed to because the plating on them still looks good. But if you need them, I'll put the part number of the bolts in the description. But like I said, I wait to put this stuff on at the end. Another thing that I wait to put on at the end that we won't show today is putting on the vent. I like to mount the vent on the pipe that's attached into the vehicle and then push this guy in after we get him installed. But that part number is another discontinued part. Front case half 36 is 124-70561. Though you can get a superseded number, they've stopped making these white nylon ones, and they've got one that's made of an elbow of aluminum. And I'll put that part number in the description as well. The next thing they would have done is they would have torqued those encoder mounting bolts to 15 foot-pounds. And then they would have taken their nice fancy $500 tool and put a new bushing in. This is why we did ours earlier, because we don't have this tool. We put it in with some manual stuff. That tool is a J45380. So obviously you do not have to have it to get the job done. The next thing we've got are seals. So we've got 3 seals that we're going to put on. So let's get ready to put those on next. All right, first of these last 3 seals is the rear output shaft seal. They make the point that there's a square tab that needs to face straight up and a drain hole that needs to face straight down using tool J37668A. Now I have this J37668A tool. You can see here it's about a 1/4 of an inch in thickness. The outside diameter is about 3 1/8, and then it's got a slot here that's kind of critical of a 1/2 inch. It's going to mate up with the seal. The seal that we're going to be putting on here is replacing rear case half part 1, and we're going to be replacing it with the GM 125-47638. There's a lot of these different transfer case seals, and they're not all interchangeable. For this 246 and 236, it's this particular number here, right? So that little notch, and this tool meant to fit several different ones. Fits on just like that. Now, it's pre-lubricated from GM on the inside diameter, and then the outside is rubberized. So you don't have to put any kind of Permatex or anything like that on it. Now, another tool I have that's very similar. This is a tool from Merchant Automotive, 10695. It's the same kind of thing, just an aftermarket tool. Fits on the same way, right? Either one of these can be used to drive it on. All right, so like they say, right, you want to align the notch on the top and the drain hole on the bottom. And the easiest way to know if you got it in the right position, in my opinion, is line up the notch with this ridge right in front of your little plug that you put in. That's a good way to line up that you've got it right in the middle. And then we just need a rubber mallet, and we can drive it in. Gotta find what I did with my rubber mallet here, guys. Tools like to walk off in the middle of these projects. All right. What you want to make sure of down here is that it's seating flush right under this ridge. It doesn't take anything more than a rubber mallet to drive it in. All right, now we're going to have to lay it on its side and do the other two. All right, guys, next up is the front output shaft seal. The 246 is an internal sealing design and force fit on the shaft, and you have to have a special tool for that. They say that you need the 43-484 hooked into a J8092, and then for the 236, you need a 44-636, which is a totally different type of tool. And then they talk about how you do that with these old tools. However, we're not going to use those tools because there was a service bulletin 22 years ago, right, that revised this. And basically it says that there's a revised transfer case seal, part number 124-74947, and that's what we've got here, 124-74947. This replaces the seal that was previously used that was shown in the service information, and it has to have a new tool. So this tool tool changed to J43484. It still uses the 8092, and that's what this looks like, 43484. I'll give you measurements of this after we're done, but let's go ahead and get it installed. All right, so these guys, they just continue talking about installing it on the 236, and the 236 also has a dust seal on the shaft. Since we're doing a 246, we can skip over. Once we complete this, we'll just have one more left. Henko en Mexico. All right, so this guy is going to come off. And that's right, this is a guy that we had so much trouble getting off earlier. He's like a two-piece design, right? The outside turns, the inside stays stationary. This is the one when we tried to get it off, it came apart. But we can see that the design is very different now. All right, so this guy's going to go on here. And we're going to use this tool, which is going to insert into the shaft so that we can drive this in. Let's go see where our mallet went again. Actually, this one I think I'm going to use a dead blow hammer because we're going to be doing a friction fit on metal. So to ensure that it seats properly, we're going to need a little bit more oomph than a rubber mallet. Make sure your unit is where it's not going to walk on you, and just drive it in. One for good measure. All right, there she is. Last seal we have left here is the front input shaft seal. And the front input shaft seal is front case half 33, part 12547466. There's our old one, that we deformed on the side to pop it out. The spring side always faces in. This guy's going to go over on this one. He's much less of a tight fit than the first one. And as the service manual says, he gets put in with the J42738. This one we can go back to our rubber mallet. All done. Might give him another whack later off camera just to make sure. Yeah, he's got a little bit of a ridge right there. There we go. All right, now. All right, guys. I mentioned to you I would show you the dimensions of this J43484. So the bore area is just about 1.3 inches in millimeters, about 33 millimeters. I don't know if I have a big enough measurement for the outside. Let me see. Yeah, we do. 86.16 millimeters. 41.6 millimeters high there. Overall height of the whole enchilada, 89. All right, guys, and the measurements on this J42738. So the outside is about a 1/2 inch thick. The outside diameter is 3 inches. The inside diameter is 2 inches on the nose. Now another tool that you can use besides this Kent Moore one is another one from Merchant Automotive, the 10325. It's made of metal, unlike plastic, but you can see same dimensions almost. It's a little bit smaller on the inside diameter, a little bit smaller on the outside diameter. Just shows you there's some flexibility in putting that particular seal on. All right, guys, another thing that the service manual doesn't talk about doing is installing the drain and the fill plug. So rear case half part 8 is our cleaned up original, and again these have to be aluminum. And rear case half 9 is our original drain plug. Again, aluminum. Aluminum into magnesium. And we're going to go ahead and torque the drain, but we're not going to torque the fill because we got to fill it when we put it on. But they're both 15 foot-pounds, both drain and fill plug. That's it, guys. We're done. That's the last page. So at this point, we have completely rebuilt, remanufactured, actually, new seals, new bushings, new bearings, new retaining rings, new gaskets all the way around. We'll put our encoder motor and seal and bolts back on. After we get this remounted to the transmission, we'll also plug in our vent after we get it remounted to the transmission. Don't forget to install a new gasket to mate up between the transfer case and the transmission extension housing. I hope this helped you out. If you got questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below and I'll try to help. If you saved some money watching this video, or you learned something, or you just simply found it entertaining, take a moment to hit that like button. I'd really appreciate it. It helps the video get discovered, and that helps me. And if you find this kind of content interesting, hit that subscribe button because I do it every Friday around 3 p.m. Eastern. In-depth videos that do lots and lots of detail as much as I possibly can. As always, thanks for watching.